So, welcome everyone. Today we've got the Keynote, Roundtable and Fireside Chat with Brant Cooper. Brant Cooper is the New York Times bestselling author of The Lean Entrepreneur and CEO of Moves the Needle, with over 2 decades of expertise helping companies bring innovative products to market. He blends agile design thinking and lean methodologies to ignite entrepreneurial action within large organizations. Brant has a unique take on disrupting our current way of thinking in order to be closer to customers, move faster, and act bolder. And he has experienced monumental milestones such as IPO, acquisition, rapid growth, and crushing failure. And that's why I wanted to put you guys all together, because what I really love about the conversations I've had with Brant is just the realness. And, we all run, we're all members of the ecosystem and running companies ourselves or supporting companies. And we, as champions of innovation in the city, we have to be positive, and sometimes we don't get a chance to be very real. And that's the kind of moment that I'm hoping to create on this panel today. And we're going to record it. I'm definitely going to turn it into articles and things like that. So I'm hoping that this discussion becomes agenda setting for the future. But I will just talk. So we'll start off with a short discussion, Brant and I invite you guys to listen, but do active listening. So if you can take notes and things like that, and just think about points that you want to reflect on in the later part of the discussion, that would be amazing. And yeah, anything where it's oh yeah, we need to get real about that. That's what we would need to talk about here today, So, Brant, welcome to St. Louis. St. Louis Startup Week, EQ, which stands for Entrepreneur Quarterly. Thanks for being with us today.
And Thanks for having me. Yeah, excited to be here. I love to see all this activity going on in other ecosystems. So super happy to be here.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And that leads me nicely on to the first part of our chat, which was you've talked at startup weeks all over the country, all over the world. And when we were talking about pirate metrics, which was a kind of methodology for sort of reporting on the growth of startups, you also mentioned, that growing an ecosystem, needs to be open, inclusive, extraordinarily purposeful around diversity. It needs to include the underrepresented in furthering tech skills, but also include all entrepreneurs. It needs to include small businesses, food startups, all of the non-tech. So your view is everyone's involved in this. It's not a kind of classist activity. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I lived up in Silicon Valley area for 16 years, and that's really where I lived through the .com boom and bust. And to be honest, it was fun and exciting. And if anybody ever wants to move to Silicon Valley, I think it's a unique experience. But it's also very limiting. And so I grew up in San Diego and moved back down here in 2007. And I think that sort of started giving me some perspective on, sort of what the non-Silicon Valley world looks like. And San Diego, in particular, is 450 miles from San Francisco. So it's not a suburb of San Francisco. It's, if we were in the Midwest, it would be multiple states away. And yet, if you were a startup in San Diego and you wanted to get investment, there was very weak investment in San Diego, and you were forced to move your startup to Silicon Valley. And the same is true with really other startup ecosystems. Back in the day, you kind of had to move to Silicon Valley in order to get the funding, and it was really a requirement. In other words, even if the venture capitalists came to you down here in San Diego, they would say, "Okay, I'm giving you money, but that means you have to relocate to Silicon Valley. And of course, this is happening all during the boom as well, when housing prices are going crazy and just the living costs of the Bay Area were going crazy. And fundamentally, it makes no sense at all, right? To make more people move to the Bay Area when everything is already skyrocketing. And so I think that actually me getting the heck out of there gave me some perspective, but also I could see where San Diego's ecosystem was lacking. And after the Great Recession is really where we started to see, I don't know how it applies to you all, but you started to see a burgeoning startup ecosystems that come out of recession. And that back in those days, everybody was calling them Silicon something, Silicon Beach or Silicon Slopes or Silicon this, Silicon that. And it drove me crazy because I would sit there and try to tell people in San Diego, you don't want to be Silicon anything. There's, more Silicon on the beaches than there are in the startups. And so it's not really, we don't want to be by Silicon, like Silicon Valley. Let's not recreate the tech bro culture. Let's use what we have here in San Diego and do things better than they did, and open, actively recruit underrepresented founders, Black founders, and Latino and Latina founders, and women, and we can actively do that so that we're reflecting, the ecosystem itself is reflecting who we all are. And so I think that sort of the advantage of being up there and then out of, you can actually make it better when you're starting it over. And so I think that, generally over the last 10 years, what we've seen are these ecosystems that are emerging that don't pretend that they want to be Silicon Valley, that they get to do it differently. And the part of it is that eventually we've got great schools around us that are producing great business people and great engineers, and we want to keep them local, and we want to grow our local economies, and we want to find job growth, and we have to keep that stuff local. And I think that startup weeks are a great way to do that. And I think that there's a lot of assets and resources locally that allow us to do that. And so I think overall the mindset has shifted towards that. So I'm not revolutionary in any extent in that. It's happening. I'm just seeing what's happening, not because of it happening.
Yeah, and I had a similar experience. The Silicon for London, us being English, was Silicon Roundabout. So it's like the least glamorous kind of Silicon version of a city ever.
All right, that might be the worst one I've ever heard of. Okay.
Funnily enough, it literally was a roundabout, and it was in like the kind of the remnants of the banking district. But that's been the kind of interesting thing. I was doing trying entrepreneurship in London, and we weren't Silicon. We hadn't even invented Silicon Roundabout. And we were just like, oh, we're English people trying to compete in this American thing. And we had massive self-esteem issues. We just weren't, ever going to make it. And then moving to New York, the bit that struck me was like, even New York startup scene has self-esteem issues.
No doubt. Yeah, exactly right. Yep.
And then, no offense, St. Louis, I moved to St. Louis, and it was like, self-esteem was like right down here. And that's when I was like, this is just an illusion, a mental illusion, rather than reality. And you started to see, one of the things I noticed with London, New York, and St. Louis is actually the startups that came from these cities did have a kind of DNA that was reflective of the environment they had started in. So New York was all fintech and property, and London had a lot of fintech as well. And funnily enough, St. Louis is kind of like, they joke it's the third coast of fintech or the finance industry. And so you see that here. And actually St. Louis is starting to embrace the fact that it's got its own DNA and can build its own identity now. So I guess my question around, that kind of stuff is like, how do we, people think they need to grow can we still build big companies without having to emigrate one day? Are we deluding ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that I don't think that one has to worry about the cultural identity part of it. I think that the people that want to grow the local system are committed to growing the local system. And I think that there's you know, Silicon Valley was supposedly not a consumer ecosystem until Facebook moved there and went public there. You know, and you could just like sort of, you know, go down the examples. It wasn't a SaaS ecosystem until a SaaS company goes there. I mean, so an identity is actually not created beforehand. So an identity is created by who exits. And the moment the next company exits that's in a different industry, that's your identity. And so it's all kind of BS, to be honest. And so that's, again, to me, why one is inclusive. If you have, you know, again, I started out as like, okay, yeah, tech, Silicon Valley style tech startups here in San Diego. And then you realize the person that's doing a food startup or is doing, you know, an e-commerce startup or is, you know, it doesn't matter. I mean, the needs that they have are similar. The challenges that they face are similar. And so that's actually what the ecosystem is about, not identifying it as being some particular industry vertical. Those things happen naturally or they don't happen naturally, and it just kind of doesn't matter. Now, there's fundamental differences between, say, a small business. You know, you want to open up a restaurant or a dry cleaning, or you want to do an agency. You know, you're doing web dev or marketing, or you want to create a scale startup. There are differences in those ambitions of the founders, typically in how they're financed, how they grow. But one doesn't have to create the ecosystem that chooses one over the other. It's an ecosystem. It's a complex system. There's interaction, there's interconnectedness. And it works best when you know, they're allowed to sort of form those type of connections organically. The role of people that are trying to create the ecosystems is really to sort of bring them together and then get out of the way. One of the ecosystems that had the lowest self-esteem that I ever ran across was actually in Lisbon, Portugal. And it's actually really amazing what they've done now over the last 10 years. I mean, just extraordinary.
That's where, like, that huge web conference is there.
That's
now,
right. Yeah. And just really very successful. But I was there in the early days, and an entrepreneur, an older gentleman who had run several big businesses, came to me and said, listen, the problem with all you ecosystem developers is that you make it seem too easy. You know, you have all of these entrepreneurs and they're given all of these resources. They're given seed money, they're given advisoring, they've got all of the domain experts that are all these resources given them. And what you're denying them is actually the fact that they've learned how to knock down the brick wall. You know, they've got to learn how to hustle. And if you just give all of this stuff to them, they don't learn that. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And so I think that this is why, you know, kind of gets to the earlier point, is that in the end, the entrepreneurs have to play a super strong role in the ecosystem development, because there's often all of these resources that want to come to bear. And it's really sort of, what are the actual needs of the entrepreneur that needs to be leveraged, needs to be understood. So the ecosystem developers are almost acting like a startup themselves. They need to get empathy for the people that they're attempting to serve, for the entrepreneurs. And then they're trying to figure out, well, what's the best sort of resources or things that we can give them that allow them to succeed. And so a lot of ecosystems, San Diego included, when I first moved here, were sort of dominated by these sort of legacy institutions that had completely lost focus on the entrepreneurs. They were focused on providing opportunities to the service providers because that's where the money was flowing, as opposed to the entrepreneurs who actually just needed to figure out how to get going.
And Brant, what you're saying, and I think you're tapping into, is like, there's a regionalism, right? So the ecosystem developers are building on the kind of overall philosophy of regionalism, and, economic development. But in the end, we kind of, all the ESOs and support organizations kind of get trapped in a narrative around certain type of kind of king-making stories, so how much investment dollars are going in. And what I'm hearing in what you're saying is like, we have to turn all of the struggles into stories. And I think a lot of the ESO members struggle with this too, right? It's like, how do they get their story of the smaller companies that they've managed to, get them to win a prize or launch their first product and things like that. And they don't make the news, and they don't fit into the kind of economic development narrative of major success, but actually they're chipping away at all of the problems that are holding back entrepreneurship in general.
Yeah, I think shining a light on success stories is one of the more difficult things to do in a young ecosystem. San Diego was fortunate, I guess, because Economy actually decided to put one of their publications here. And I became friends with the guy that ran that. And he was coming from Boston, wanted to do things differently because there were a couple of established business magazines or business newspapers here in San Diego, and they wanted to do something differently. And so they had a component, part of their publication that they were dedicating just to, the ecosystem and young startups. And so I would run what I call demo days that were not at the end of an accelerator program. They were just merely me trying to get young startups to go in front of peers, other startups, to show what they were working on. And that was sort of just to create this, this interplay between startup entrepreneurs so that they could feel like they were the ones that were creating the community, so that they would be the ones that were helping each other. And a matter of fact, kind of a funny story from that is we called that San Diego Tech Founders, and the founder of GoFundMe demoed at one of those meetings, Brad Damphouse. And so this was before it had really gone out at all. He had two startups. The other one I want to say it was called like PayGo. And he's all like, yeah, I've got two startups that I want to, demo. But I'm going to focus on PayGo because I don't really know where GoFundMe is going. I think that's my secondary startup. And of course, nobody's heard of the first one that he demonstrated. And it's the second one that actually, became a unicorn. So, but anyway, really the story is that there's a way that you have to try to even create the shining the light on part yourselves as a young ecosystem. We also had almost like a startup here, a digital local investigative news source called Voice of San Diego, which is really amazing and successful here. And they, again, since they were an emerging entity, would shine a light on really the young startups here. And I think that helped the ecosystem.
And, one of the things you talk about as well is like building the base of the pyramid of entrepreneurs. And you've said, startups should be invested in the later stages and prove their business model, but you want to see like the wealthy concentrate on building the bottom of the pyramid. And then, but then at the same time, a lot of the funding money doesn't want to do these kind of very small investments. Like, how do we get more? What's the stories we all have to tell to like get more money into the bottom? Like, do we talk about, is everyone a startup or are they something else? Can we call them upstarts? I keep wanting to call everyone an upstart rather than a startup.
I think it's really hard to change the language. So I think you got to stick with startups. I think that that's, you have to go find a bunch of investors that are willing to lose money. That's right. Pretty tough.
Okay, where are they?
It's pretty tough. Grand Rapids is actually a good example and the Amway family funneled a ton of money into Grand Rapids, and they had their own version of an accelerator program that didn't follow all of the other models, but invested tranches of money into startups that participated in their system based upon progress that they were making. I don't know if they've got a positive return on investment or not. They don't really need it. They're wealthy enough, and so wealthy families is one way to do it. Inside of wealthy families that actually want to see the local growth. San Diego has never had that. San Diego has suffered from that. And so it's taken a long time for our bottom layer pyramid to get funding. We have a lot of real estate investors here that decide they want to get into startups. And so they look at startup investing the same way they look at real estate investing, and it doesn't work. And they plop 15 or 25K into one startup, and then they sit back and wait for their returns to come in. And I pretty much say, like, no, you've lost that 15 or 25K. I mean, it's almost has to be the mentality. If you're going to invest in one, you should be betting that you're going to lose that money. I mean, that's just fundamentally how startups work. It takes 1,000 to get a unicorn. And that means a lot of investing in startups that never go anywhere. And I actually think that there's opportunities here that I don't understand why we haven't filled this middle. It's hard to make money these days on the stock market unless you're just willing to sit in there for 25 years, right? You can't go and get a savings account that's going to pay you any interest. And so there's massive middle where you can actually do startup investments that doesn't require equity growth. It could just require returns, interest returns, which would be like massive. I mean, we just don't even have that anymore. And there's a woman entrepreneur in Washington, D.C., Roshana Novelis, who started a startup there that funds women entrepreneurs, and it uses that model. You can go onto her website and you can actually make a interest investment or an equity investment. And to me, that's like, man, I don't know why that's not in every ecosystem, because we need to have a financing system that is making bets on singles and doubles and triples, not everybody looking for the equity home run, which again is like, maybe 4 in 1,000 that get to any sort of massive level. And it unfortunately teaches investors, like non-startup investors that want to move into the startup, their mentality, it immediately goes to like, oh, well, yeah, I'm going to be, Paul Graham, or I'm going to be, Fred Wilson, and I'm going to go for the home runs and I'm going to get 100X. And it's like, no. If you care about growing an ecosystem, if you care about, creating a sustainable innovation economy with job growth, then we have to be rewarding the small businesses and the quote unquote lifestyle business, which has become like a disparaging title for people grow like a business that's got 100 employees and makes $10 million a year. And that's somehow a negative. Yeah. I mean, we got to be shining a light on that and celebrating those and thinking about financing those in a different way that doesn't require venture capitalists on one side and banks that want a bunch of assets on the other side.
Yeah. So, you know what? I think this is a good opportunity to bring everyone else in, and we'll just bring everyone in. But, I wanted to spotlight some of the work Monique's doing, actually, to your point, Brant, which is, Monique, you've got this accelerator and you're not even using the word startups. You're just, you've even kind of changed the language to supporting small businesses, and you're awarding 50K to those people who come into the accelerator. And what I find really exciting about what you're doing is it's to Brant's point around building the base of the pyramid. You're doing like a lot of entrepreneur discovery on behalf of the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. So it's interesting. I was just chuckling as you commented on several of those things, Brant, because it's something that we talk about behind the scenes and what we're doing. It's like, man, how can you get out of that mindset and then, focus on that area? So yeah, you're right. it's not just your traditional startup. It's we're funding that base. And I think that's important, especially as we look to see how we can change things right here in St. Louis. It's like, okay, let's start here and see how, if that trajectory will change somewhere else, and people will catch on and say, okay, they did it a little bit different over there. Let us try it. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I think that it's, one of the things that we haven't figured out that somebody ought to figure out is how to connect those people in all of these different ecosystems that are trying these different things. It's sort of known as federalism, right? If you've got, for example, 50 states that are trying to solve a problem in 50 different ways, if they can share with each other the ways that work, then that's actually can be replicated. And Monique, I think that there's people all over the country that are trying stuff just like you are. And we somehow need a way to get these people together so they can share ideas and share what's working and what doesn't work and how to overcome obstacles and all the rest.
And Tyler, building on kind of, you've sort of been holding the fort on this conversation for a while, that, it's not just about entrepreneurs and startups, it's about makers and side hustlers and all of these things. How are you bringing that narrative to your funders and trying to win money based on that?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think most people are still particularly interested in what we think of when we hear startup, which is tech. And but what we found, and I think which contributed to our pre-COVID attendance, in person, was that it was more interesting to bring everybody from various backgrounds together, because it was those kind of unexpected collaborations that would happen out of an AI person talking to an artist, and so we were intentional about just finding, what kind of people are, it's the language is, I find personally annoying in the startup community too, because it's I don't want to call everybody an innovator. I don't want to call everybody they're not all entrepreneurs if they're not making money. So I was just kind of doing these broad, strokes of makers, doers, and entrepreneurs, right? And that type of mindset is more what we were trying to attract, right? Who are just curious people that want to make things. And that could be a business, or it could be some sort of project. I find that that's the most interesting. Those are the people that make stuff, right? Like GPS, that whole technology was created around people meeting at a coffee shop talking about whether or not they could record the sounds of a satellite, right? So these seemingly bizarre conversations turn into real technology down the road, and that's the kind of environment we wanted to foster. But I'll say, and then I'll quit rambling here, is that I really appreciate, Brant, your comments on this stuff, because I think something that it's very easy for startup ecosystems to fall into, and even myself, it's I see something that's not happening, I'm oh, I want to go do that. But it's so important to have the entrepreneurs leading the entrepreneurship community. And it's so easy for us as ESOs to be oh, there's a gap, I'm going to fill the gap. And it just gets really stale that way. And because our interests are does our funders want to support what we're doing for our entrepreneurs? And it's easy for us to get pulled away from our core, why we started in the first place. So I can't stress enough. And I think St. Louis is guilty of this. Not, nothing malicious, of course, but it's we need to get back to how do we empower or even leave some of them alone so they can build some of this stuff themselves, But my role in that is just how do I help facilitate those conversations so they can build stuff, right? Call attention to things versus versus doing things all the time from an ESO position, which is hard because a lot of ESO people are entrepreneurs.
I just want to say one thing, Tyler, when you said just what we call people and then this terminology we use in the ecosystem. It's so funny you say that, because when I was asked to do this panel, I don't really come from the startup space. I'm really from the nonprofit background. I just care about community and I care about people, and that's what my passion is. And I'm do you want me to do this panel? Because I don't use the startup colloquialisms. I don't use the right words. I'm do you want me to do this? So it's funny you say that, just the words that you use and the right words. And if you called someone an innovator, they get offended. I'm oh. So yeah, I just care about people. I just care about changing the landscape of this community. So funny.
And even naming Startup Week St. Louis was like, I think that may have taken like several months, because we're like, well, if you don't call it Startup Week, like no one's gonna, honestly, it was like a real conversation. I was like, oh my gosh, how do we get here? Like, we're debating whether it should be Startup Week or Innovation Week or Small Business / Startup / whatever. Anyway, I could go on, but it's a goofy thing. Not right or wrong. It's just, how did we get here?
No, I totally feel you. I I think we went through all of that. And so, it's, in the end, there's some words, like when it's working, it kind of doesn't matter anymore. Like then people don't even care about the labels, because it's almost like we look at it forward worrying about it. Like, I've never in my life called me an entrepreneur. If everybody's going to run around and call me an entrepreneur, that's fine, but it's kind of on them. It's like, I couldn't care less. And so I think it's, I don't know. I think you guys are you just gotta go do it, and the language will evolve, and a lot of it's not under your control anyway.
And actually,
just
that's
cool
where,
stuff.
what I'd really like to bring Steve in at this point, just because I recently did Steve's kind of weekend think tank. And what I loved about it was entrepreneurial thinking without being an entrepreneur, if you like. It was so accessible, and it was things like your business model is different to your product, and it was distinctions I'd completely forgotten, even though I call myself an entrepreneur. And I just felt, Steve, that some of the work you've been doing in this area is like turning everyone into an entrepreneur without them even knowing it, and creating the mindset kind of stealthily.
Well,
So
and
anyway.
it was really interesting. I think sometimes even as innovators, we miss some obvious opportunities. So I'd had my own business for 38 years, and I flunked retirement a number of times. And I do teach entrepreneurship now at St. Louis University. But after my first attempt at retirement, a little company here in town named Boeing recruited me to be their entrepreneur in residence, to create an entrepreneurial spirit within a large corporation. And one of the things I would say to people listening that have ideas, don't immediately think of the big corporations as your enemy, because what they have is the ability to help fund ideas much easier than you might find from your standard venture capitalist. And we were out looking for small companies that were doing interesting things. And one of the things I had to teach Boeing is you can't apply your big company values immediately, because you'll destroy a little company. They don't have time to do all of that stuff. But I would say to people, keep your eyes open. And one of the things that we do at SLU now, one of my classes is corporate entrepreneurship, how to be entrepreneurial within another company. And I've got to tell you, there are a lot of very innovative people who have fantastic ideas that don't have the risk tolerance to go out on their own, but they're still entrepreneurs, and we can learn a lot from them. Go on, John.
Well, that's a good point to bring in Luke now, because Luke and I work together, and one thing I love about working with Luke, even when he went and did his own startup, is the way you're thinking is, I think you felt that working with me was a kind of good training for you, and you've taken that philosophy into your employees and your new company. And it's the way like startups can be a training ground.
Yeah. There were a few things I wanted to comment on in this discussion. So the first one was why we feel like we're put in a box with the startup label. And we keep kind of using this term tech. And what does tech actually mean? And why do so many businesses that we in St. Louis think of as startups not seem to fit that label? I think it comes down to this pressure that, technology is fundamentally about, can you serve an additional customer at no additional cost, or such a small additional cost that it doesn't matter? And most businesses just don't start out that way. Clever certainly did not. We match homeowners with real estate agents and negotiate to get lower commission for the customer. The core product was operations. It was people on the phone. It was talking to agents and negotiating. And that was the point of friction in this transaction that we could take out. We could have conversations that customers didn't want to have with real estate agents. And if you do that a couple thousand times, suddenly there's the possibility to start to build some technology around it. But I think it's natural for most companies to start with operational problems and not need to get into technology until much later in their life cycle. And that's one of the things, being on the startup side of this conversation, that was difficult for us to navigate early on, because in conversations with investors and in the way you present yourself, everyone wants to know, well, where's the technology? And the reality is that has not been the true source of innovation in the business until this year, our third year in operation. Years 1 and 2, the technology was really an afterthought. And the second point there, Jonathan, to tie to what you were saying, about, you know, when we're talking about an ecosystem, what's the value of it? From my point of view, so much of this is about the individuals in a community and the expertise that they build, which is really, really hard to sink your teeth into. And people don't like that because you can't measure it, you can't quantify it. But if someone goes through a startup that went from 5 people to 500 and IPO'd, well, the people inside that business are incredibly capable, and they now have seen the things they need to go start new businesses or drive that kind of growth in other places. And a good case in point is, you know, I worked for Jonathan. He was my first and only boss, and you know, bless him, here I am. I learned a lot of things that were incredibly useful for in a very short amount of time, and it's hard to get that level of mentorship without entrepreneurs in the community. So
and to
that's
that
all this
point,
is.
yeah, like, you know, I absolutely loved what you just said around operations. Like, maybe that's part of the storytelling change we have to do, right? It's not about tech, it's around operational disruption. And I feel like Alfred, Arch Grants does this a lot. Arch Grants has a really good way of spotting someone who's going to disrupt the operations, even if they haven't quite like completely nailed the tech side of it.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, when Clever came in, I think they were in their, I was like the second year of the business. So yeah, like, you know, we try to figure out, you know, okay, this entrepreneur is somebody that has a really interesting idea, and like, let's say they do have some semblance of a product together. Well, how can we be helpful in just making sure that we put the right people or the right connections around them to go ahead and do what they need to do? Which I think somebody said this before, around just kind of getting out of entrepreneur's way and just, like, you know, not being so in the weeds. You know, I think what we try to do a good job of, especially the program team at our experience, is like, you know, we're not like, we have our quarterly meetings, and, you know, we try to make it more concierge. So like, you know, what do you, like, entrepreneur, what do you need from us? Not what do we need from you to, you know, do certain things. You know, of course, we got to do data collection like a lot of other economic development organizations or whatnot. But like, you know, we try to make sure that, you know, we're not going to be blowing you too much, like blowing your email up with too many asks, you know, from our end. It's really just like trying to be service first, which goes into another point that I think was pretty interesting, like that Brant brought up around like city self-esteem, and like self-esteem around startup communities. And like, I've been to St. Louis for now 2 years. Like when I first moved to when I first visited St. Louis, and it was actually to meet up with our experience. There was like, I was amazed by the ecosystems. Like, you're getting to see our experience. So they took me over to the Cortex area, and you start learning about the Danforth Plant Life Science Center. You start hearing about biogenerator, and you're like, wow, like this is actually like a really strong ecosystem compared to like where I came from in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I think every city has its own things that like they wish were better. But that was one of the things I noticed, that St. Louis kind of, it's always like this, like, oh, I'm sorry about whatever, or like this weird self-esteem issue. But it's like, you know, like we have good pieces, and we have like a lot of strong pieces that a lot of cities that are similar sizes or even sometimes bigger than us don't have in place. And you look at a lot of cities are actually, you know, looking to copy a lot of things that St. Louis is doing well. And I think the reason why is because we have this kind of culture of like service first and trying to do a good job of not being in the entrepreneur's way too much. So yeah, like, you know, for us, we want to just figure out like, how can we, you know, whatever stage you're at, what are the pieces that are helpful to you to kind of get you where you need to go.
Yeah. I'll just say, like, you know, I think Lindsay and Eric, actually what they do really speaks to some of the things you've all just said as well, which is just like, we should be getting excited about disrupting operations. And there's all these, and you know, the startup community creates this conversation around innovation that other people can get involved with and sort of practice disrupting operations. So it's like, Lindsay, you're like trying to tell, you've kind of skipped print messaging and articles entirely and just tell the whole story of the ecosystem through social.
Yeah, and I think that's something too that St. Louis and entrepreneurs in general do really well, is finding the fastest way to get your story across. And right now that is social. But one thing I wanted to kind of talk about is whenever you think about, you know, St. Louis, I think suffers from a little bit of an imposter syndrome. And I think a bit of it is because, you know, we're Midwestern and we want to, rather than tout ourselves, we're going to pat our friend on the back. But I don't think that's a bad thing, because I had a conversation earlier with one of our clients, and, you know, you think about St. Louis and the startup ecosystem here. When it comes to support, I've never been told no. I've never asked for a supportive meeting or a call and been told no. But you think about other cities and it's very competitive. And so for me, the startup ecosystem, I think, is just really based upon community and change makers. And I think that's the story that we all need to kind of keep sharing and just be really open to.
And actually, that's something Eric's been doing a lot of, is highlighting change makers through Bourbon Friday, and you're always spotting like people disrupting operations. Even if they haven't worked out what to sell yet.
I think from my perspective, when I sort of came into the startup community about 5 years ago, and I did so by working out at T-Rex, and, you know, a few people, Jonathan and Luke, I know them from there. So being involved in that community, it really was even after working in the agency world, it really felt like, oh, this is the thing I was supposed to be a part of, not the agency world, where it was all about, hey, well, make it look great and that's it. Well, no, let's solve some real problems. And something I have that we see is we need to be telling these stories of these smaller companies, because if you look at our urban core, it's not going to be giant companies or whatever that's going to fill up these streets with people. It's going to be small companies and small businesses, and that we have to be able to help them as well and promote those stories as well.
Yeah, it's like a culture of innovation, right? I think a lot of what's coming through is like, there's a culture of innovation to create. Brant, do you want to respond to our warts and all? You know.
Well, there was a lot of different threads going on there, but, you know, I think that I think it's just important to understand that there is a different businesses and the steps, and one way I like to think about it is that a scaling startup creates demand for small businesses, but not really the other way around. So in other words, if you actually succeed in creating a scalable startup, then you've got more employees there and you've got more, you know, people coming to that area. And then in order to support those, you need agencies, and you need the dry cleaners, and you need the restaurants, and you need all of these other entrepreneurs that are creating those other types of businesses. So I do think it's important to think about the difference. It just is in the ecosystem itself. Everybody is welcome. In my view, one of the things that I really pushed in San Diego was that the ecosystem was inclusive, but also curating. So in other words, you don't let everybody that wants to do anything. Like, we had a lot of problems with mentors and EIRs and these other people that are trying to get on the boards of startups and that are trying to get them as clients because they're strategy consultants and all this other kind of, you know, BS. And so those people are like, no, you got to kind of play by the rules, or you can go and do your own thing. I'm not stopping you. You're just not part of this ecosystem, which is here to benefit the ecosystem. And so I think the curation aspect is actually becomes important. And, you know, I started San Diego Startup Week, and the most difficult thing, this is actually kind of getting to what you were saying, Tyler, the most difficult thing was the transition from, you know, one leader that's doing this stuff to others that have to actually take over. When I wrote this book and that kind of took off, and I this new, I no longer run my meetups and my startup San Diego stuff, and I you know, other people to take over. And the greatest success in San Diego was people taking over for me, not what I did, the fact others and scaled it. And to me, that was like, it's such an important point, because we had other entrepreneurs that stood up, did what they needed to, that it wasn't about any one individual or group of individuals. It was about the ecosystem itself. So I don't know. I guess those are a couple of thoughts that I've had on what people were saying.
But it's like, yeah, you gotta, I like the idea of turning the teacher man to fish into like the success story rather than the amount of investment capital.
Well, it was hard though. Like there were a lot of people that would say that they would stand up and then they didn't stand up. And I think that the ecosystem still suffers from that. You know, we, our startup week is, you know, 100% volunteer. And we're up to, like, the last public one we did was, you know, 3,500 attendees, and we held it in the convention center, which is just mind boggling. When I started it, it was 150 people going to 5 events, and so other people scaled it, not me. And it's just completely, but it's still based upon volunteers. And you get people that'll stand up and say they'll do something, and then they don't, but they're volunteers. Where's the accountability? I mean, it becomes really difficult. And some of the meetups that I ran have never, the coffee meetup that I started is actually still going on, which is amazing. But the tech founders one I run isn't going anymore. And I think it's too bad, but it's like, there's so many events now that, I don't know, the system evolves.
Yeah. And out of interest, I mean, yeah, Steve, you were going to talk about, you want to chat about mentoring, but I was just wondering, like, Brant, you made a kind of point around over mentoring, and that can get kind of tiring from the founder perspective of just like too many mentors. Steve, like, how do we mentor without over mentoring?
So we have a program here. We originally picked it up from MIT, which is called the Venture Mentoring Service, and I think they call it now IMT. And what it is, it's open to the whole community. You don't have to be part of SLU or anything to use it. And we take whatever your idea is and present it to a group of mentors, about 100, and they pick the ones they want to work on. And this is where Brant was really, I mean, this is really critical. We have rules so that our mentors are not allowed to invest in any of the organizations. They are not allowed to work full-time for them, and they cannot sell them any services. So our mentoring is free, and it's team-based. So you get a team of 3 to 5 people, and you as the entrepreneur call the meetings. So if you don't feel you need help, that's okay. But when you feel stuck, you can call your team and say, I need help, and we'll be there to help you. So I think what we have found in St. Louis, and we've been doing this now for almost 14 years, is that this really provides a different level of help, that a lot of the mentors, like Brant said, are there to sell services. We absolutely outlawed that when we first started.
That's cool. And actually, Luke's got a comment about this too.
This is again coming from the perspective of a startup that's benefited a lot from nonprofits and ESOs in the ecosystem. But it seems like the ESOs also face the imposter syndrome that we've talked about the startups having, and is this kind of question of the catch-22 of as a support organization, it's hard to have operational expertise in running a startup. If you could hire someone with that expertise, well, they're probably running a startup. And it's hard to have investing expertise, because if you had investing expertise, you'd probably be running a VC firm. And so what can the support organizations do? And one that I feel the support organizations in St. Louis have done really well, for instance, for us, this was Arch Grants, is kind of legitimizing the company when you're still really, really small and you can't get your story out. So EQ does this as well, kind of getting the story out. But if we're a company trying to get a partnership with a much bigger organization, they haven't heard of Clever, but they've heard of Arch Grants, and they know that there was a gala and someone high up in the organization went there, and it has that ring of, okay, this might be a real company who we should actually sit down and talk to. The one I see organizations struggle with a bit more that as an entrepreneur would be really useful on the mentorship side. You know, you want the operational mentorship, you want the investing mentorship, but there is this middle ground that I think there's a big gap on as an entrepreneur, which is when you sit down with your investors, after you close the deal, they become your closest advisors. They teach you how to manage your cap table. They teach you how to negotiate about investment rounds. But before they're your advisors, you are negotiating with them. You are going in and they are trying to get the best deal possible in biting off a piece of your company. And that's a really complicated transition to navigate. So I think one of the gaps for entrepreneurs that nonprofits are in a really good position to plug is helping entrepreneurs navigate those early conversations. Once you've gone through a couple investment rounds, now you have a bench of very experienced people to help guide your decision making who have a financial interest in the success of the company. But before you get there, navigating those conversations effectively is one of the biggest parts that you navigate without a good playbook.
So one of the things that an ecosystem can't be shy about is bringing people from outside the ecosystem. So when I was running my tech founders meetup, I was bringing people down from Silicon Valley to talk in person to the startups. And to be honest, San Diego was behind in things like user experience design, the skills of product management, angel investing. All of these things were in the ecosystem to a low degree, but there were not really people that could mentor on that. And I think that one of the biggest, I think it's great, Steve's got a great mentorship program, but one of the toughest things in ecosystems around the world is the quality of the mentors. All of the mentors want to give back, not all, but the ones that we want to keep want to give back, and they have great advice and there's industry expertise and all of these other things. But for a lot of young ecosystems, there aren't founders that have actually done successful things. And those are often the best mentors, are the people that recently raised money or recently did some growth hack that worked, or, you know, so I think that those things are difficult. And so I think that you have to be willing to go outside the ecosystem. And of course, the Zoom calls make this all possible. During the pandemic, we're all remote. So who cares where people are from? And so I think it's important to look for those assets. And then as you have successes locally, you then have more mentors. But one of the biggest problems you'll have, at least what we had, is getting the successful entrepreneurs to give back to the community. There's this phase in there where successful entrepreneurs didn't get help from the community. They had to do it on their own. So it's not natural for them to give back. And so that becomes difficult to try to get them integrated into that giving back aspect.
Brant, one of the things I'd like to ask you, because this is very much what we deal with every day, most of the mentors that we recruit, let's just say, are more mature. Once you're over 70, you don't say old anymore, right? Okay, but what we found is there are a lot of successful businessmen and women who do want to give back, and they don't want to be on a rocking chair, and they've sold their businesses and they're willing to help. And I've got hundreds of those. My problem is, how do I find the younger person who has recently been through a success and wants to give back because they just want to start another business? And that's been a gap that we've had trouble filling.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I think it's what they have to do is feel like they're the type of people that actually don't even want to have to deal with your agreement that says that they won't consult with them. I mean, I totally understand. So I think it's just, if they care about the community and they want to give back, you just make it as easy as possible for them and say, listen, I'm not talking, you don't have to come to the intake meetings. You don't have to meet. It's really just allowing them to do, like, if you're willing to help one company for 1 hour, a couple of weeks or something, but you create a limited program for those people to be able to contribute to a company that they like. That's how we've been able to get those involved. But it's, I can't say that I've completely figured that out. I think it's difficult. Techstars has got a Techstars Everywhere program now. And one of the incredible things about it is that they've got these mentors from all over the world. And I'm a mentor there. And so it allows me to meet with mentors, and they literally exist everywhere. And so I sometimes leverage that to try to find regional mentors that might help. But I think, I don't know, maybe this was partly what Luke's point was. It doesn't necessarily have to be the founder, right? So some of the older people can give advice around specific aspects of managing people, or navigating the ups and downs of being, entrepreneurial, or how do you actually engage with larger companies like Boeing? I mean, so there's a bunch of expertise that they have that they can contribute. But like growth hacking principles or user design or product management, you don't have to go find a startup founder. You just have to find somebody that's an expert in that, who has worked for startups. And so if you open up that field a little bit about who you're willing to consider a mentor, I think you can find that expertise, literally everywhere. It could be somebody that's currently at, a local startup, or Grubhub in Chicago, or Basecamp in Chicago. They're everywhere. We just have to look a little bit deeper, I think.
I mean, I love what you're just saying there, which is, something you just identified is what most startup founders want right now is growth hacking mentorship. They just need to pump the numbers as much as possible. And you're right, there is a kind of generational difference that we have to kind of acknowledge there. But then similarly, so many of us have kind of not, so many founders now haven't even done like a proper job before founding a company. And they don't even write like emails that are formal enough. They can feel like you just got a text message and the ask is all structured wrong. So that's where I feel like, the older generation has got a lot to contribute. The insight I'm getting from what you're all saying, though, is we have to consciously split this and stop pretending that, mentors, Monique, Alfred, Tyler, we need to create a kind of boot camp around marketing, a mentor program around marketing. And it's clearly going to have Eric and Lindsay in it too, but that's a big gap that can just be filled immediately, that opens everyone up to all the other mentorship that they need. Because our most immediate problem is visibility.
Let me ask this, Jonathan, if I can, because this is Tyler and Brant both. I mean, I love Venture Cafe. My number was close to 200 because we used to get a name tag with how many times we'd attended. And it was great to have all of the collisions. But what if we had a special Venture Cafe night or a 39 North night, and we invited people with money and people with ideas, and just had a big open, talk to whoever you want, move around and see if it gets exciting, and maybe people will bump into each other. Brant, have you tried anything like that before?
I've done something similar where I had people that were looking for startup roles and startup founders. So people that had tags on them, like we actually sent us to the universities to get the students, but people that had like product management expertise or user expertise and were looking for startups, and then founders could connect with them. But Dave McClure used to run a meeting like you were talking about, and I thought that they were great. I went to a couple up in Silicon Valley. He was the inter of the pirate metrics, to tie it back to how Jonathan opened. But what he would do is it was invite, but he would have special ticket prices for investors, and then he would have a lower price for startup entrepreneurs. because you have to kind of pay for the dinner or whatever, but it wasn't completely freeform. And then he would have a speaker, and he would have a facilitator at every table to have the conversation starters around the topic that the speaker was doing. And so it was a little bit less, it was a little bit more structured than what you're talking about. And part of the reason for that is a lot of investors are afraid that they're just going to get pitched the whole night. And so that they don't kind of want to be in that situation. And so you try to create a social structure where people are meeting each other as human beings and talking about something that's not one trying to get benefit from the other. And if they hit it off, or if the conversation was steered towards, like, the investor asked the entrepreneur what they were up to, then that conversation could naturally flow that way. But it was really more around the social engagement to get the investors and the startups in the same room so that it could have a more human connection that might lead to a relationship like you're talking about. And so I don't know, I think that's a great idea. I haven't seen that replicated other places, and you should give it a try and let me know how it goes. Run an experiment.
Jonathan, I'm gonna rope you into helping get this thing started.
Yeah. I think I just got my marching orders.
Yeah, I want to.
So we're just hitting.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and say, we are talking about by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs. I think it's on a lot of us and startups, especially, to reach out to people and to find people to actually help us do things. I mean, like Lindsay said, she's rarely had a no. I know when a startup founder asked me advice or whatever, I never say no. And most of the times I just say, oh yeah, I'm at Bourbon Friday, 4 to 6 every week. Go meet me there. Right. So I think it's on the entrepreneur to reach out to the mentor as well.
Totally. I think that there's a whole range around, I've run into this mistake myself is, if I was mentoring somebody and they never reached back out to me, I would say, oh, well, they're just not very entrepreneurial. And it actually took sort of me to have this mindset that I actually have to teach the mentors how to be good mentees. And so there's a lot of what you're saying there is true, is that why would a young person or a person first into business, no matter what their age is, know what the expected behavior is? And so you actually have to sort of demonstrate it and teach people how to take advice and how to ask for advice and how to ignore advice, right? And so you could be very respectful if you're getting mentored by, someone a little bit older who has like tons of advice. Well, maybe some of that advice is no good. And you could be respectful and say, well, thank you for the time that you gave me. And then you can ignore the advice. And so that's a sort of a form of empowerment, is to teach people how to respectfully, ignore advice.
And we need that in the Midwest. Everyone's too nice sometimes.
Well, you can be nice in person. It's just you go home and ignore it. I mean, that's fine.
I do have a question kind of about, maybe what's the best way to make the ask? At our core, I think entrepreneurs and startups, we're all solving some sort of problem. So when I ask for help, I try to frame it around the problem I'm trying to solve. And that, I think, when I kind of garner the best result. But I don't know, I think maybe some of the viewers might want to know, like, what are the best ways to ask for help?
Is this to somebody specific or asking the community generally, or?
It could be either, because I think every company is going to be doing, you potentially have the opportunity to do both. So maybe yes. Kind of start with asking funders or.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you should never sort of go up to a funder and ask them for money. I mean, you should think about things in terms of a relationship, and that's really what you're trying to establish, is human relationships. And so you have to be thinking about developing empathy for that person to begin with. It's understanding who they are, what their background is. Can I go see if they've written any articles? Can I participate with them on social media? So, sort of the whole social leverage part of it. Can I show that I'm actually interested in them as a human being before I actually, start going down a path of even asking them to help me? So that's step one, is doing your homework, doing some groundwork. Getting a warm introduction is always nice. And so if you can get that, ensuring when you're reaching out to them that you're not going to take very much of their time and that they can say no, that it's safe for them to say no, leveraging their expertise. So use their ego to a certain extent, but be honest about it. Like, you are an expert at XYZ and I could really benefit from that. And if I could have 15 minutes of your time, I'm happy to share what I'm up to, or happy to share something else, or happy to make introductions. Most people that I think are sort of more advanced where you are, I think a vast majority of them are willing to help out. They want to help out. It's ingrained in us as human beings to provide value to other human beings. So we want to do that. And so if we just can pause and think about what we would want in their situation, which is a cliche, but I mean, you know, it actually works. If we can just pause before we go and do that, then you know, I just, they're gonna respond positively. And if they don't, who cares anyway? I mean, we get a bruised ego for 5 minutes and then we move on. I mean, the downside of this stuff is so not very far down, then, you know, that we just, you know, we have to be willing to give it a go, and we'll learn. If we do it wrong, hopefully we learn from it and we do it better the next time.
Thank you.
And also, I just love that you're saying, like, you know, human relationships is part of it. And I do think that that's something we can all remember. You know, it's not even the story, it's just the connection. And that's what we need to, you know, that's how we solve the structural, some of the other structural things that are in the way of entrepreneurs, you know.
Well, I think, it's another thing.
Founders.
Yeah, it's another thing that Luke was sort of alluding to earlier. You know, it's like, it's not about automating this stuff until you actually, you know, do it in person first and then figure out what you can automate. And so, you know, by definition, you're starting with the human to human part. And, you know, people should think about marketing as the part of a sales that you've already figured out that you can automate. That's what marketing is. And so start by doing person-to-person stuff. And then if there's things that in the end you can scale through technology, more power to you.
There was one insight, Brant, that I wanted to circle back up on, because you said it so casually, but it was one of my my favorite moments from the conversation so far, which was about pulling in folks other than the founder from startups, and having you know, all of the organizations and the events and the things that we think of as the ecosystem look beyond just the founders and find other leaders within the startups, especially when they're reaching roughly the size Clever's at. And from a founder's point of view, one of the problems I think we run into is, you know, a founder's personal brand is the company. All that matters is the company successful. And so there's no real net benefit to going out and promoting yourself as an individual when you could be investing that time in making the company successful. And pragmatically, that's not true for some of the people who are driving a lot of growth and results at Clever, but are not myself or my co-founder. They really could benefit a ton by having the career advancement that comes with building a bit of a personal brand, being able to share some of the expertise they've learned. They're often the ones now driving some of the recruitment efforts for their team. And so they'll benefit more by networking and meeting people they could bring into the business. And even on a more ecosystem-wide level, what that does is we want to be able to get talented people to make the jump from bigger companies into startups. And the more that startups are glamorous places to be a leader, a person building your career, the more that gets you out in front and able to build a personal brand that can make your next move in your career after the startup to something even more exciting. That is such a big accelerator for startups who are trying to compete for talent and get the brightest people to go take a big risk by working for a small, unproven company.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
Luke, I got to tell you something. And Brent, here's an idea that maybe you can take back. When I was at Boeing, one of the things we did is we hired some young people who wanted to be entrepreneurs and put them in positions to see how a business could be run. And I got to tell you, they have gone on to be able to do some great things. That we would hire them for 2 years at a time. And I really believe that gave some young men and women right out of school an opportunity to see things that they wouldn't otherwise see. And I really believed it helped them be more successful instead of just immediately going into a business and having to learn only from failure.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting.
So should we see, thank you so much for amazing conversation. I'm wondering if I'm just gonna read out some of the comments from people listening. And if you're listening, feel free to write more and let me know if you want me to tag you into the chat. But, so Jill said she likes the phrase about the stuff we were talking about. What do we name people? She said she liked the phrase community and change makers. And she's asked panelists to help me understand what entrepreneur means. She hopes to find what similar companies, so she thought community and change makers was kind of another alternative to just sort of founders and funders and entrepreneurs.
So fundamentally, to me, the way to get beyond what are you calling people is to, or tech or not tech, is to think about the mindset. And so in my next book, I'm talking about 5 elements for what I call disruption for all, which is really around us sort of taking the horns of disruption and making sure that it benefits everybody. And so the 5 elements are empathy, exploration, which means to go and admit when we don't know and to go try to learn what works. Evidence-based decision-making, so that we're cutting through our biases using data and insights. Equilibrium, which is establishing a balance between execution work and exploration work, but also creating a balance in our personal lives so that we've got not only work and life, but family and wellness and spirituality, if that's important to you, and that's what we need as human beings, is that sort of balance. And the last is ethics. And those 5 E's, those 5 elements are really around who we want to include in the ecosystem. People that sort of live that and use that, whether they're benefiting from a nonprofit or a social impact or a philanthropic point of view, or trying to create new growth inside of a large business, or trying to be that as an entrepreneur. And those are all elements that can be practiced as well in building an ecosystem. And so I think that it's, we get hung up on the labels when what we should really be thinking about is the mindset.
Yeah. And you said empathy, evidence, equilibrium, and ethics. What was the 5th E?
Exploration, I think.
Exploration, that was it.
And Brant, let me throw something at you, because in my class on entrepreneurship, people get innovation and entrepreneurship mixed up. And this is maybe too simplified, but innovators come up with ideas, entrepreneurs put them into action. And
yeah,
I think that's what
I actually even have a problem with the word innovation, to be honest, because it's been so overused that it doesn't mean anything. Actually, innovation isn't the idea. Invention is really more the idea. Innovation is actually, I think, entrepreneurs successfully innovate by bringing invention to the masses. So innovation is actually creating value for people. That's what innovation is. And so entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial minded people can be both inventors and they can be innovators. But in the end, it's about creating value for human beings.
Thank you. I really like that.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. So Dick Fleming has a question in there. So we actually got a question. So I wanted to see if we could jump over that so we could, not that I actually have a great answer for him. So I think that,
so the
I
question
frankly don't think that we're going to be able to redefine capitalism as being that capitalists have to do actual philanthropy. But on the other hand, if they think that that's part of their mission as a corporation, then I think that they should go off and do that. There is a whole movement in all ecosystems around social impact entrepreneurship. And so I think that that's powerful. And I think that they should always be a part of the main ecosystem. I think that they suffer all of the same obstacles and challenges that small businesses and startups face. I kind of joke there's a different sort of mythology in the social impact entrepreneurship. So in sort of the regular startups, there's the myth of the visionary, which is that they have some sort of eureka moment and they have to go and build that startup. And, there's really a lot of media gives this mythology. Thomas Edison, his story is a myth. Steve Jobs' story is a myth. It's something that we repeat over and over again. Whereas on the social impact side, it's the mythology of the do-gooder. And the mythology of the do-gooder is that they think that they're doing so much good for people that everybody's going to come running to them and fund them. And the constituents that they're serving are all going to line up to get their services. And that's not the case either. They actually have to learn how to drive impact. And they actually have to show their investors, who are often foundations, that they are driving impact. So they have to increase the impact upon investment. And so I think that they face a lot of the same issues as regular startups do. And so I just think that they need to be part of the ecosystem. I don't think that we can convince people to do more of that. I think the moment it becomes to them a viable option, then there will be some people that will choose that path and some people that will not.
I just want to add one quick thing, Jonathan, if I could. So I also just want to be mindful that, corporate philanthropy is not a dirty word. I mean, I know that that's a misconception that, some corporations only give because, they're really polluting the earth and they're just trying to give to, glaze over that. But, there are some corporations who really see the need and it's like, how can we step up? How can we be a hand raiser and really to help solve that? So I just don't want us to look at that and make it seem like it's like a bad word.
Totally. Yeah. I agree. Thank you.
And to add on to that, I will push back a little bit on like the notion that St. Louis isn't extremely philanthropic, because Arts Grants itself would not be an organization today if it wasn't for corporate and local family philanthropy and them giving money to Arts Grants and then funnel that money back to entrepreneurs. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think there's, always more people in St. Louis that we could tap into and, to give money back to entrepreneurs through grants. But I will say that, we are on the right trajectory in regards to venture philanthropy, in regards to philanthropic dollars being used to impact entrepreneurs. We are seeing that compared to, there's still a lot of other cities that are, if not the same size or bigger than St. Louis, that do not have programs like Arts Grants, like Boston Foundation, like other very philanthropic funded nonprofits that provide funding to entrepreneurs. So we'll say there is, it may not be Denver, but we are doing we're doing our thing here in St. Louis on that front.
Thanks for that, Alfred. And I think it's great to, again, all this stuff should also have a light shown on it. I really think that it grows if we can get the foundations to act more like investors. My company actually had, for a couple of years, we did work with nonprofits to teach them sort of these lean techniques. And what we found is a lot of the foundations, towards the end of the year, they're almost acting more like corporate budgets, where they're just like trying to give away the money because they're responsible for giving away a certain amount of money every year. And instead of acting more like investors, where they're giving out tranches of money based upon the nonprofits driving the impact that they're supposed to be doing. And if we were able to set up that sort of ecosystem within that nonprofit philanthropic social impact world, I actually think that you'll see opportunities for successful social impact entrepreneurs to grow based upon their success, as opposed to grow or not grow based upon their ability to raise money.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about what Monique's doing with the DEI accelerator for UMSL, is that's being funded by Edward Jones, I think. Is it? Yeah. Did I get that right?
Yeah, so Ameren, Edward Jones, and Express Scripts. Yeah.
Yeah, and what's really cool about that is they're essentially funding that entrepreneur discovery in a whole segment, you know, of underestimated founders, and we're pushing more founders through the system. And I guess, you know, I want to ask Steve, like, Steve, you're quite pro like corporate collaboration, you know, using Brant's concepts. Can we just go to all the big companies in St. Louis and go, look, you're going to give all this money to charity. Can we just like hold it in this one place, you know, and then, you know, create a kind of panel of, you know, entrepreneurs to then decide who to invest it to?
So what you have to understand, all big companies have different requirements for what they do with their dollars. And you have to know what the metrics are that they want. So if they are interested in bringing businesses to St. Louis and you can convince them that your program will help bring business to St. Louis, great. If they're interested in finding people who will bring minorities or other disadvantaged personnel into the business community, then your metrics and your pitch has to be along that line. I don't think there's one pitch that works for all of them. And so the homework that you have to do is figure out what turns each of them on and then make that the lead that you take to them.
And I have one point to add here. I wonder personally is if you look at all the metrics, whether it's in hiring, whether it's your purchasing decisions, people, millennials and Gen Z, they want to work with socially responsible companies. And if you look at the US economy, we're talking about 70% of it is based upon consumerism. You know, that shift may happen naturally because you want to sell, you need to market out, you need to market that you are socially responsible. So that shift may happen already.
I think we need to empower those voices too. So, I mean, I think that based upon, I've talked to organizations that have, you know, corporate board members there, and they are under increasing pressure from for example, shareholders that are interested in human resources management. So in other words, how employees are being treated, and the boards listen to that stuff. And so they hear millennials and others that actually where that's important. And so I think that's I think you're exactly right. And it's just another way that we need to make the megaphone a little bit bigger so that these corporations hear that that's a requirement.
So guys, thank you so much. I'm really pleased that we can have this conversation. I'll thank you individually. I mean, unless you have more comments, but I thought better wrap it up. You know, we've really talked it out, and I think, you know, set some agenda possibilities for the future, which was exactly my goal. So thank you. Really, you were just like a secret research project for me. But thank you, Lindsay, Alfred, Monique, Luke, Tyler, Eric, Steve, and Brant. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it today. And Brant, I hope you'll come back and maybe in person one day. And
yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to come back, and really, I encourage, you know, not only everybody here on the panel, but, you know, anybody else listening to connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter and all the rest. And happy to. My email's brant@brantcooper.com. So, you know, happy to get all of you.
And the other thing, if I may, for St. Louis University, the SLU Start program that we do is free to anybody who's interested. Please contact me. You don't have to be in St. Louis. You don't have to be part of the SLU world. Our goal is to help people start businesses that will make money. And whatever we can do to help, it's funded by the National Science Foundation. So please, you know, again, sepner@slu.edu. Be glad to help anybody you know get started.
It's really good. I'll vouch for that. And I'll send out a promotion to everyone, actually, like introduce you all to each other. And I'll just tell you that we got applause to all the panelists and thanks from Tim O'Sullivan. So I think you can all put a feather in your cap and get a beer.
I'm going to thank all my 30 corporate sponsors before we go. I'm just kidding. All right. Thank you guys, though. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.